Welcome to our Mind Institute Facebook Live, where UC Davis health experts provide information about important topics. So I'm Patrick Dwyer. I'm a PhD candidate in developmental psychology in the Neurocognitive Development Lab at the Center for Mind and Brain. I also do quite a bit of research with the Mind Institute. And today we'll be talking about a topic that is personal to me. I'm an autistic researcher who does autism research, and we'll be discussing the language that researchers use in their work and the wide-ranging impacts that it can have. Two experts have joined us to talk about this important topic and answer your questions. Christine Wu Nordahl is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and a Mind Institute faculty member. She is a non-autistic autism researcher who studies how the brain develops during early childhood in autism. And Kiki Godfrey is a graduate student, disability advocate, public speaker, writer, researcher, and mother. She's also an alumna and faculty member of the Mind Institute's Leadership, Education in Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities program, known as LEND. So thank you both for being with us today. If you in the audience have questions during our discussion, please post them in the comments and we will answer them towards the end of this conversation. Now, without further ado, let's start with some background about this topic. In the autism world, I think it's fair to say that non-autistic professionals and researchers, non-autistic parents, autistic people, often tend to hang out in different circles. And I wonder, could we be learning to use language differently in some of these different communities? And could some of this terminology be stigmatizing or harmful? So Christine, can you tell us more about the terminology that you have learned to use as a neuroscientist?
Sure. Yeah. When I first started doing autism research, that was back in about 2005, autism was very much thought about as a medical disorder. So it was seen as something that needed to be fixed or cured or even prevented. We didn't even use the term autism. We spoke about it strictly in terms of the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. We talked about autistic people in terms of their deficits. We categorized them in vague terms like high and low functioning, without really thinking about the impact that these terms have on the people that we were trying to help. And I think, some of these terms absolutely make me cringe now when I see that I have written these terms in my early papers. And what I've come to realize is it's really critical to consider that all of these terms and what I learned about autism as a new autism researcher back then, I learned all of these things from non-autistic scientists in the field. And now I realize how problematic that is.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I know it's hard to, speak from that position of humility. So I really appreciate how open you are and frank about this. Thank you for that. Kiki, you're in the rare position of being both a parent, an autistic person, and a researcher. And moreover, some of your research has actually looked at language preferences in some of the different communities in our autism world. So I wonder if you can tell us, based either on that research or on your own experiences in communities of autistic adults, what autistic advocates might think of some of the traditional terminology that researchers like Christine are being taught to use.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I think that language conveys attitude and social dynamics, and people with a disability are commonly marginalized and seen as, a minority. Being autistic is definitely a social identity and representative of a larger community. I think that a lot of it comes down to identity first versus person first language. Person first language is used by clinicians and it's influencing parents as well. Those are terms like, child with autism versus, autistic child. And that identity first is more preferred by autistic individuals. Words and language, they shape conscious and unconscious beliefs and biases. The medical model includes a lot of pathologizing and deficit-based description language. I think it's really important to say that autism is not a disease, and it's also words like disorder, deficit, maladaptive that are harmful. So I think that later on I'll talk about kind of reframing that, language into a more positive frame.
Yeah, thank you. It would actually be perfect if you could talk about that right now. What sorts of terminology would you recommend we should use instead of some of these traditional terms like, just deficit and everything that you were just mentioning?
Of course. So reframing language can be as simple as changing a negative into a neutral fact or a positive based statement and, giving some more descriptive language. So instead of narrow obsessive interest, it can be modified into heightened sense of interest. As well as restrictive and repetitive behaviors can be modified into enjoying making the same sound over again, or having a sensitive palate and liking certain foods. These types of constructive statements are also more useful than harmful functioning labels, as Christine mentioned, like high or low functioning, severe or maladaptive behavior. And using this positive language can promote positive concept and acceptance. It also comes from a place of humanity and empathy. It validates lived experiences, it affirms a person's worth, and it promotes positive mental health.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that. And I know all of us here think it's very important to listen when groups of people tell us that they find this terminology to be offensive or harmful. But I do often hear from people who have concerns about some of this language that's preferred by autistic neurodiversity advocates. And Christine, I'm wondering if you might hear some of these sorts of concerns as well from your colleagues. And if so, could you tell us more about what is concerning people?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, Patrick. And we think about autism as a spectrum, and there we talk about how much heterogeneity is in autism. And I think one of the biggest concerns about the neurodiversity movement is that it may not be representative, or may not be hearing the voices of all of the individuals on the autism spectrum, and particularly those who are perhaps non-speaking or minimally verbal, or individuals who have co-occurring intellectual disability, or those that engage in self-harm behaviors or wandering behaviors. The concern, I think, is that some of those voices may be marginalized and maybe not as well represented by the more vocal neurodiversity advocates.
Yeah, I definitely have heard a lot of people expressing those sorts of concerns. It seems to be a very active debate in our community. So Kiki, I would love to hear what response you would have to say to people who have those sorts of concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's definitely an issue that, I've heard come up, and it can be hard to include all voices, but it's something we should definitely start looking at and doing some more research on. But I think it really goes back to the process of reframing language in a way that's preferred by all, using more positive terms to describe autism traits and individual preferences. This would go a long way towards self-tailor approach to services and supports, receiving individual help, self-happiness, and self-worth. And studies have shown that there are a high percentage of co-occurring conditions such as depression and anxiety. And this has to do with people not having basic needs met, not having a sense of purpose or goals, not feeling safe or supported or heard by caregivers and professionals, and not having connections or feeling a sense of belonging. And this is really hard to do when people can't accept who you are. Not having a sense of self-worth, self-esteem, not feeling a sense of importance or respect. And I think that terminology could go a long way to change these facts and to reframe things into more of a positive mindset about how we view autism overall as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all really, really important points. And one thing that I think is particularly important to emphasize, that you did mention in your response is that, yeah, advocates want supports. Some people have some idea that neurodiversity advocates are somehow opposed to supports, but as you were saying in your response, we do want supports, and in fact, there are some things that aren't being supported now, like the anxiety and depression that are so under-recognized in people with intellectual disabilities, for example. So yeah, that is very important to emphasize. And also, I'll just take the opportunity to mention here that the Mind Institute and the Center for Mind and Brain recently hosted a neurodiversity summit focusing a bit more on some of these issues around non-speaking autism and intellectual disability, and other populations that might have high support needs in a lot of contexts. So I think that the link to that will be posted in the comments section at some point for anyone who is interested in checking that out after we're done. But for now, we are still talking about why language matters in autism research with two experts in this area, Dr. Wu Nordahl and Kiki Godfrey. And if you have questions, again, please post them in the comments and we'll answer them towards the end of our discussion. Now, I know one specific debate that's become very controversial in our community and that you already alluded to, Kiki, is that between person-first language terms like person with autism and identity-first language terms like autistic person. So Christine, can you say a bit more about which you were taught to use and why?
Sure. So again, I was taught by non-autistic people to with the kind of terminology to use. And one of the very first things we were taught was that it was more respectful to use person-first language. And the idea was that autism didn't define the person. And so we were supposed to say child with autism instead of autistic child. And, you know, it was not something that I questioned. It's something that I just accepted. And that's how I started writing in my papers and my grants and speaking. But thinking back, you know, when I would interact with the participants in our research studies, a lot of the parents referred to their children as autistic children. And I think that there was the disconnect between what the researchers thought was right and what families were actually doing in the community. And I had always stuck with person-first language, but now that I have engaged more with the autistic community, I realized that it really is a personal preference. And I was making assumptions before that I shouldn't have been making. But I think it's important to say it all came from a place of wanting to be respectful. And so I think that having conversations like this is a good step in sort of re-educating autism researchers to rethink about how we think and talk and write and speak about autism, and make sure that we're hearing from autistic people what their perspectives are as well.
Yeah, those are great thoughts about the need for dialogue, and I'd love to circle back to them later. But Kiki, you know, your own research on this topic of identity first and person first language has shown some preferences in the community that strikingly differ from the terminology that Christine learned as a researcher. So can you say more about identity first language and why so many people in the community prefer it?
Sure, yeah. I definitely echo, you know, what Christine had to say about, you know, being open and learning more about the preferred language, which I think so many people at Mind Institute and in the autism community in general have been, you know, great about doing is, you know, really listening to the community. Many self-advocates and allies really prefer, you know, the individual first language like autistic person or autistic individual, because we have, you know, this lived experience that we can really understand that autism is a part of an individual's identity, the same way that, you know, one refers to African Americans, the LGBTQ plus community, or the Jewish community. It helps us to feel validated and gives a sense of community and positive self-concept. This all depends on the person's preference and how they want to be referred to. I think that, you know, that's the biggest message is, you know, just ask the person what their preferences are so that you can be on the same page with them, and then they will feel heard and respected.
Yeah, thank you. That is such an important point to be listening to to people. And, Christine, you were just mentioning as well this idea of dialogue. So I wonder, Christine, if you could expand on that, or if you have other suggestions about ways that we could encourage researchers and professionals to change their language choices in ways that respect the preferences of the community.
Sure. Well, as we've mentioned, just talking, having open communication, having, I think and I can't speak for all researchers, but there's some idea that maybe we'll be defensive about the language that we've been using. But I just think it's important. And that's why, Patrick, I so appreciate having so many conversations with you about this, that it's all coming from a good place, and that we just need to be open and communicative and not defensive and not attacking. And one thing that I would like to highlight is here at the Mind Institute, we recently had a whole seminar on using respectful language. And we had a wonderful panel of autistic researchers and parents and autistic individuals talking to us about that, talking to the Mind Institute research community, educating us on terminology and asking some of these hard questions. And I think we're going to go ahead and post that link in our comments page. It's an hour and a half long, so it goes into a lot more depth than what we're able to do here. But I learned so much from it, and I thought it was a really positive experience, and other colleagues here at the Mind, I think, have expressed the same thing to me. So dialogue is really important. I think another thing to do is, other than changing the way that I personally speak and write about autism, is engaging the younger generation of trainees coming through and talking to them. And they're learning how to talk about autism in a completely different way than I learned how to talk about autism. And I think that's how change happens, is with this next generation of researchers as well.
Thank you so much. I'm also encouraged by many of these changes, which you have had a role in. I mean, that you organized the language seminar, and thank you for doing that. Now, Kiki, I wonder as well if you have some thoughts about what we can do here about those issues, as well as things like the way that professionals are talking about autism when they're speaking to parents of young, newly diagnosed children, for example. And really introducing those parents of newly diagnosed children to the way that we talk about autism. What needs to change, and what ideas do you have about how it can be changed?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I think that overall, education is so important to, changing the tone of things, the importance of involving autistic people and researchers in projects is very important. Using positive self-affirming language. And, the LEND program, it's an interdisciplinary program with, many young people who are in college or have just graduated college, as well as parents. And I think that this is a really great way to, introduce these topics early on. I just did a presentation to all of the LEND faculty, and hopefully I think it's as well being shared with the LEND trainees as well, all about inclusive language and how we can incorporate that into everyday life, as well as presentations and research. And then I'm also currently working on a presentation for school-aged children through LEND to introduce them to autism and what it is, using preferred terminology and promoting self-acceptance, as well as reframing autism in the mindset of children and teachers, modeling that positive language. And I'm hopeful that this will help change future generations' thoughts on autism and promote self-acceptance and demonstrate autism as a natural part of human variation and alleviate stigma.
Thank you. Now, we have a really interesting question coming in from the comments, which is how do some of the sort of established institutions out there, like insurance companies or the DSM, that's referring to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, where you'll find things like the clinical definition of autism spectrum disorder and all of the deficits in it, for anybody who's unfamiliar with that term. What role do these sorts of bodies play in maintaining deficit language?
Sure. I'd be happy to answer first, and then Christine can follow up if she would like as well. I think that they play a very large role in, you know, the sort of pathologizing language that we have going on, especially, you know, the diagnostic criteria. I mean, that's how you get diagnosed with autism. That's, you know, like your important first step. I know when my kids were little, you know, taking them and doing all the testing and you know, everything that was involved, you know, it was confusing, it was overwhelming, and it was also slightly stigmatizing, but you know, luckily they had me right there with them to kind of explain the process and, you know, clarify things for them. But I think it does play a really large role in it, and I think that it's something that definitely needs to be changed and reframed in a more positive way. I think it'll allow clinicians to have a little bit more freedom too, because if they see, you know, something as big as the DSM criteria changed, you know, it will go a long way towards, you know, opening up that language for them to use in research as well.
Thank you. Christine, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, as a non-autistic person, I don't have a lot. I mean, I don't have personal experience with this, and so maybe you do, Patrick. But I will say, you know, when we're writing grants and when we're trying to get funding to from the NIH or from other agencies to conduct our research, and our research is really about improving the quality of people's lives. But that's not going to get you necessarily a grant. You can't just say that. So there is, you know, you do have to, it's a fine line. And I think it's a challenge that I'm facing right now in terms of how I write in grants where I want to get funding. So I'm sort of using that analogy with the insurance companies, but you know, you do have to medicalize it in some way in order to say that it's a big enough problem so that you should give me some funding so that I can research these questions. And it's shifting, and you know, there are definitely differences in how I write grants now, but I think it's a challenge, and I'm not completely sure how to face that head on. But yeah, it's a tricky question. I imagine it's tricky for getting access to services for kids or in schools and things like that. So if you have anything to say about that, Patrick.
I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head there with that sort of dilemma of like, how do you demonstrate that this is a genuine issue that needs to be addressed, whilst also not using terminology that's offensive or stigmatizing, which is such a tricky question, as you say. And I guess one thing that I feel like we could try and do more is using terminology that is neutrally descriptive of some of the challenges and barriers that people face. Like, for example, you know, we have a tendency to talk about social deficits in autism, but there's some really fascinating research out there that's increasingly showing, well, wait a second, you know, a lot of autistic people have much easier times interacting with other autistic people or people who will be accepting of quirks and differences. So, you know, to what extent is this like a social deficit within autism versus is it a lack of acceptance from non-autistic people or some complex combination thereof? And so maybe, you know, we can reframe our language in such a way that we're acknowledging, yeah, these are serious and genuine challenges, and you know, people are facing all of these barriers and difficulties as a result, but without necessarily, you know, making those sorts of value judgments as to in our terminology itself as to where it's coming from or whose fault it is, and certainly not if, you know, we're saying that it's like on the individual. So it's really challenging and tricky, I know, and you know, that's an example that I deliberately picked because I thought it helped make my point. But I feel like there's still a lot more that we can do to go in that direction. That would be my thought.
Yeah.
As any final closing thoughts? It looks like we are getting close to the end of our time here. So either of you have anything at all to add about this topic, either that last question or anything in general about language and terminology in this field.
I would just encourage all autism researchers to engage with the autistic community. You know, Patrick, you've been really helpful to me when I write papers, and you can suggest alternate, or you can just point out where I've maybe could use better terminology. That's just really been helpful and always challenging me. And it should just be a dialogue. So those are my final thoughts.
And I completely agree, you know, with what both Christine and Patrick have said, is that, you know, we should constantly be thinking about the language we're using, and you know, challenging ourselves, and using other autistic people, as well as just, you know, putting ourselves, you know, in somebody else's shoes, and just, you know, using that humanity and openness. And then regarding the last question, yes, it is such a hard thing to say, like, where do we start, you know, to shift this? But I think dialogue is the number one key, and education, and, you know, introducing children to what autism is at an early age, you know, providing resources. These are the kinds of things I'm always getting involved in, you know, education and providing resources, and just saying, you know, I'm here to answer your questions, and, you know, I'll provide you with all the information I have. And I mean, I think that's as much as any of us can do.
Thank you. Those are wonderful closing thoughts, the importance of dialogue and resources. And on that note, I believe that there are some resources that are going to be, or may already have been, added to the comments. So you can take a look at those on your spare time. Some of them are actually resources from Kiki. And others are just resources out in this field that are relevant to this topic of language. So thank you all for being with us today. We really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us for this UC Davis Health Facebook Live. If you do have more questions, you can still post them in the comments, and we'll try to answer those, you know, gradually over the next little while. And we encourage you to share this post if you have family or friends or colleagues who would enjoy learning from it. So again, thank you all for joining us today.